This webinar was recorded on April 13th, 2022 and has been modified.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Oregon Department of Education Child Nutrition Program's webinar on financial management. This webinar is part of a series of technical assistance trainings that we are providing to child and adult food care program sponsors. The target audience of this webinar today is for non-school food authority sponsors. If your program is considered a school food authority, your participation in this webinar is not necessary, as a school food authority specific webinar will be offered at a later date. My name is Caitlin Screen, and I will be your MC for today. Dusty Kerr will be your chat and Q&A host today, and she will be tracking all questions that come in for our Q&A session at the end. For all attendees who haven't already, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat and share your name and the organization that you work for. Joining us today also are our amazing presenters, and I'll let each one of them introduce themselves now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Darcy Miller, Child Nutrition Specialist for the Community Nutrition Team here at ODE. I'm happy to be here with you today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Teresa Murray, Finance and Audit Specialist for the Community Nutrition Team. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Smith, and I am also a Child Nutrition Specialist here on the Community Team. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you, everyone. Let's take a look at what we'll be presenting today. First, I will go over our learning objectives for this training. Then Darcy will take you through the CACFP performance standards. Then Teresa will go over the minimum financial management requirements for the CACFP. After that, Shannon will walk you through the nonprofit food service financial management procedure template. And finally, we'll have time for some questions and answers with Dusty. Here are the 3 learning objectives we hope you will leave with today. First, that you will know the CACFP performance standards and the importance of internal controls. Second, that you will understand the minimum financial management requirements for the CACFP. And finally, you will have completed the financial management procedure or be on a path towards completing a financial management procedure for your organization. Darcy will now lead you through the CACFP performance standards.
Thanks, Caitlin. Most of you will remember we've discussed the CACFP performance standards during several trainings in the past, including fiscal year 2020's CACFP annual training. We wanted to give you a high-level review of them today, as they are a key requirement for CACFP financial management. In past trainings, we've said you can remember the performance standards by the acronym VCA. Before we get started into our discussion of VCA, we're going to do a knowledge check of what you know and remember about VCA. Now, don't worry. If you're new to CACFP or you just don't remember what VCA stands for, that's okay. This is not a test. It's just a poll question, and we're not tracking everyone's individual answers. So here's the question. VCA is an acronym to help remember the regulatory CACFP performance standards. What does VCA stand for? Is it A, financial visibility, administrative comprehension, and program awareness? B, financial viability, administrative capability, and program accountability? Or is it C, financial validation, administrative coordination, and program administration? I'll give you a few moments to consider your answer. And the poll will close in 3, 2, 1. All right, let's see these answers. Looks like you folks, most of you chose B, which is the correct answer. VCA is the acronym for financial viability, administrative capability, and program accountability. In the next slides, we'll review these 3 components of CACFP, so you'll be solid in your knowledge of VCA. Yes, there are 3 performance standards, and as we've just said, they can easily be remembered by the acronym VCA. VCA stands for Performance Standard Number 1, Financial Viability. Performance Standard Number 2, Administrative Capability, and Performance Standard Number 3, Program Accountability. For your reference, the regulatory citation for these standards is listed at the bottom right corner of the slide. So why are the performance standards so important? It's to ensure program integrity, that sponsoring organizations are qualified and capable of operating CACFP. Additionally, programs that meet the CACFP performance standards are more likely to be well-run and successful with CACFP. Lastly, sponsors' success with the performance standards is often determined by the strength of their internal controls, including written CACFP policies and procedures. If you are unfamiliar with VCA, that's okay. USDA and ODE are committed to making VCA a focus in our trainings, renewals, reviews, so that they are a concept you'll become very familiar with. Now let's take a closer look at the 3 performance standards in detail. The first performance standard is financial viability. Sponsors must demonstrate that they are a financially viable organization to participate in CACFP. Organizations must expend and account for all program funds in accordance with the regulations. Here are the regulatory citations and guidance which govern this first performance standard. Let's break this down a little further. For a sponsor to demonstrate that they are a financially viable organization in operating the CACFP, they must meet certain specific criteria. First, USDA states that a sponsor must adequately document their description of need or recruitment. This part really speaks to our family daycare home sponsors, as they are considered sponsoring organizations of multiple independent daycare homes or sites. A description of need or recruitment means that the organization has appropriate practices for recruiting sites and the means to employ adequate staff to meet the ratio of monitors to facilities. If you are not part of a family daycare home sponsor, this first bullet will pertain less to your organization. However, the next 2 bullets will definitely apply to all sponsors. Sponsors must demonstrate that they have adequate fiscal resources and financial history, in addition to appropriately documenting that costs in the CACFP budget are necessary, reasonable, and allowable. ODE-C&P verifies sponsors' financial viability during administrative reviews, annual application renewal, and review of annual audits for those organizations which expend $750,000 or more in federal funds each year. However, it is crucial that you, the sponsor, also determine financial viability for your organization. Ask yourself, can your organization continue to cover the daily costs of your CACFP program if there is a sudden stoppage in USDA funding? This has happened in the past. Government shutdowns and stoppages of funds are not unheard of. That is why it is so important to ensure your organization is financially viable. CACFP reimbursements cannot be the sole source of your funding. Next, ask yourself, are the costs you charge to CACFP necessary? Meaning, are they needed for your child and adult care food program to function? Are they reasonable? Would a prudent person pay this amount or create this expense? Would a prudent person charge this cost to CACFP? So what is a prudent person? Well, by definition, a prudent person is one who uses good judgment or common sense in practical matters. Next, consider if your costs are allowable. Does the cost conform to the requirements of the CACFP, or is it a cost directly benefiting the CACFP? And lastly, Are the costs appropriately documented? Do you have invoices, receipts, pay stubs, timesheets, contracts, etc. on file as needed to support costs? And finally, is the financial management system that your organization currently has in place adequate to account for your CACFP income and expenses? While you do not need to have a separate checking account for CACFP, CACFP expenses and revenue must be kept separate from other organizational revenue or expenses. Each of these questions we've just discussed will guide you to explore your organization's financial viability and can and should be revisited regularly. Let's move on to our second performance standard, administrative capability. To demonstrate administrative capability, the management practices of a sponsor must be appropriate and effective to ensure that operations are in accordance with CACFP regulations. How can a sponsor show that they are administratively capable? Well, they can do that by having an adequate number of qualified and trained staff, ensuring the effective operation of the center or site. Employing sufficient staff to manage the requirements of the program. For example, multi-site sponsors must ensure there's enough monitors to meet the ratio requirements of monitors to facilities. And sponsors must have program policies and procedures in writing, making sure that program responsibilities and duties are assigned and ensuring compliance with USDA's Child Nutrition Program civil rights requirements. While ODE-CNP will consider all of the requirements that we've just discussed to determine whether a sponsor is administratively capable, your organization should ask yourselves the following questions to conduct a bit of a self-evaluation. Are your management practices for the CACFP effective? Are the practices currently used in the CACFP at your organization helping to ensure a successful program that meets regulations? Do you have the right people in the right positions? Do staff have adequate skills, knowledge, and abilities to operate the program in accordance with regulations? And finally, do you have written policies and procedures? And not only do you have them, but do you use them? Are they followed as they're written, or do they need revision? If key CACFP staff were out for an extended period of time, could someone step in and successfully follow your policies and procedures to obtain the desired outcome? Examining each of these questions can lead you to a more capable program overall. The final performance standard of VCA is program accountability. As a means of ensuring fiscal accountability and program compliance, an organization must have controls and management systems in place. To do this, sponsors will need to maintain documentation showing that nonprofit organizations that are not school districts are governed by an independent board of directors. That there is fiscal accountability, meaning that funds are properly safeguarded and used. Records are maintained in all required CACFP areas and available for review during administrative reviews and audits. Operational requirements such as training and monitoring are being met. And meal pattern, meal service, claims, and other operational requirements are in compliance. Now it's time to do another knowledge check. Here's the question. Performance standard number 2, administrative capability, requires sponsors to have program policies and procedures in writing. What is the purpose for sponsors to develop written CACFP policies and procedures? Is it to A, help ensure compliance is maintained when there is staff turnover, B, identify who in the organization is responsible for specific CACFP tasks, C, support CACFP operations so that they are consistent and in compliance with regulations. D, demonstrate an understanding of CACFP requirements and regulations. Or is it E, all of the above? I'll give you a few moments to consider your answer. And the poll will close in 3, 2, 1. All right, let's see these results. Look at that, you guys are all doing great. Most of you, I would say the vast majority of you, answered the correct answer, which is E, all of the above. Yes, all items listed A through D on the slide are reasons for sponsors to develop written CACFP policies and procedures. Wonderful job, everyone. It is to wrap up this high-level overview of the CACFP performance standards, remember VCA. Performance standard number 1 is financial viability. Performance standard number 2 is administrative capability. And performance standard number 3 is program accountability. Now I want to tell you about a great resource ODE CNP has developed for sponsors. This handy quick reference guide was developed to help you find and remember important details for meeting CACFP financial management requirements. If you registered for this webinar prior to Monday this week, you received a copy of this guide on Monday via email. If you recently registered for this webinar, Dusty will put a link to the document in the chat box at this time. And now I'll turn things over to Teresa to discuss what information your financial management written policy and procedure should include.
Thank you, Darcy. Good afternoon, everyone. As Darcy just shared, written CACFP policies and procedures are not just a good idea, they are required. As you may remember, in February 2021, ODE CNP issued an email to all CACFP sponsors notifying them of the requirement to have written policies and procedures in place to ensure fiscal accountability of the CACFP. The email identified 5 management controls that are required to be incorporated in written fiscal policies and procedures. In this part of the webinar, I am going to provide more information about each of the 5 financial management controls that must be included in written policies and procedures, as these controls are essential to maintaining a nonprofit food service account. Here is a picture of what the email looked like for your reference. It is titled Fiscal Policy and Procedure Requirement, and it is available on the ODE CNP CACFP website. Dusty will include a link in the chat now. Okay, the 5 management controls are fiscal integrity of all program funds. Program funds are only used for authorized program purposes. Accountability of all expenses. CACFP administrative costs do not exceed regulatory limits. And safeguards are in place to prevent improper financial activities. Let's review each one of these in more detail. The first management control is fiscal integrity of all program funds. You might be wondering, what does fiscal integrity mean? Fiscal integrity in this case is defined as having strong internal controls and management systems which ensure the program operates in accordance with federal requirements. This is an essential requirement of maintaining a nonprofit food service account. Let's review the requirements and what it means to document fiscal integrity of all program funds. Maintaining a nonprofit food service account requires that CACFP revenue and expenses are tracked separately from organizational revenue and expenses, that only allowable costs per the approved annual CACFP budget and as supported by source documentation are charged to CACFP funds, and any unspent funds remain in the nonprofit food service account and are used solely for the improvement of the food service operations. Written fiscal policies and procedures must identify the accounting program used to track CACFP funds. This may be QuickBooks, Abila MIP, or some other accounting software. Establish CACFP account codes that are supported by the chart of accounts. document how unspent CACFP funds will be maintained and restricted solely for CACFP, and identify that source documents must be maintained for all transactions. If your organization does not have the ability to track CACFP revenue and expenses separately from organizational revenue and expenses in your accounting system, this may be accomplished by manually accounting for CACFP funds. ODE CNP highly recommends using the ODE CNP expense report template to manually account for CACFP funds. If a different tracking method is used, it must document all CACFP transactions, including program income, expenses incurred, and the fund balance. It is important to note the ODE CNP expense report alone is not sufficient to support documentation of a nonprofit food service account, as this is just a tool to help sponsors organize nonprofit food service income and expenses. It is not a financial management system. Financial records from the accounting system are required to support entries on the expense report. There is an expense report walkthrough training video available on the ODE CNP CACFP website, which will explain in detail how to use the report. Dusty will include a link in the chat now. Written policies and procedures for manually accounting for CACFP funds must identify the tool that will be used to document and track CACFP funds separately from organizational funds, identify the source documents that will be maintained to support all transactions, and identify all financial records that will be maintained to support the manual tracking of the nonprofit food service account. Types of financial records will vary based on your organization's accounting system, and some examples of financial records include journals, ledgers, transaction by detail report, the general ledger, income statement, profit and loss report. Okay, it's time for a knowledge check. Here's the question. True or false? Tracking CACFP revenue and expenses separately from organizational revenue and expenses is sufficient to document nonprofit food services met. I'll give you a few moments to consider your answer. And the poll closes in 3, 2, 1. If you chose false, you are correct. And it looks like the majority of you selected the correct answer. The reason the answer is false is because in addition to tracking CACFP revenue and expenses separately from organizational revenue and expenses, remember, only allowable costs per the approved annual budget may be charged. All unspent funds must remain in the nonprofit food service account and used solely for the improvement of the food service operations. And all transactions must be supported by source documentation and financial records. Okay, the second management control is program funds are used for authorized CACFP costs. I will explain how to ensure CACFP program funds are used only for authorized CACFP program expenses, or more simply stated, how to ensure that the only costs charged to CACFP funds are allowable costs. It's all about the approved annual CACFP budget. At application, all CACFP sponsors submitted a budget to ODE CNP for approval. For single site sponsors, this is the approved annual budget, and there is not a requirement to submit an updated budget each year. This is different from multi-site sponsors who are required to submit and receive approval of their annual CACFP budget each fiscal year at renewal. The CACFP budget includes planned expenditures and anticipated resources for the fiscal year. It serves as the financial roadmap for operating the CACFP. Once the budget is approved, it becomes your spending plan for CACFP, and all sponsors must adhere to it. Only those costs that are included in the approved budget are authorized and may be charged to CACFP funds, because the approved budget dictates the type and amount of allowable CACFP costs. Written fiscal policies and procedures must identify the allowable CACFP cost categories per the approved budget, identify that a budget to actual analysis will be completed, and how this information will be communicated between fiscal and program staff. If unallowable CACFP costs are identified as being charged to the nonprofit food service account in error, how will this be handled? It must identify the requirement to request a budget revision and receive ODE C&P approval prior to incurring the new costs. A budget revision is not a common occurrence. However, there are several reasons to request a budget revision. It could include to purchase new equipment, changing from self-preparation to vended meal service, significant changes in program participation, or moving from a single site to a multiple site operation. Lastly, it is important for me to restate, budgets are living documents and identify allowable CACFP costs. So at any point after the budget is approved, your organization determines that a budget revision is necessary, ODE C&P's approval of the revised budget must be received prior to incurring new costs. Now let's review the third management control, accountability of all CACFP expenses. Think of accountability of expenses as record keeping, which Darcy previously discussed. Record keeping is a requirement identified in performance standard number 3. We know that to charge a cost to CACFP funds, it must be a cost incurred for the operation of the CACFP. It must be a cost included on the approved annual CACFP budget, and it must comply with CACFP regulations and federal and state laws. There are some specific CACFP cost regulations that must be identified in written policies and procedures to ensure accountability of CACFP expenses with FNS Instructions 796-2, Revision 4, as well as federal and state laws. They are: a minimum of 50% of the reimbursement must be spent on food used to prepare CACFP meals. ODE C&P must provide approval of both the type of allocated costs and the method used to allocate costs to CACFP funds. Records and reports that support labor costs charged to CACFP funds must be maintained, and operational and administrative CACFP costs must be tracked separately from each other. Now we will discuss each one of these in more detail. The cost of food is typically the greatest expense in the operation of the CACFP, as food is essential to preparing nutritious meals served to program participants. Written fiscal policies and procedures must identify that a minimum of 50% of the CACFP reimbursement will be expended on food. This is an ODE C&P requirement. To determine if the 50% food cost threshold is met, the following costs may be used in the calculation: costs of food purchased used to prepare meals served to participants, delivery fees or food transportation fees for this food, purchased vended meals, purchased meals from a food service management company, and maintenance fees and costs for donated foods. Now let's discuss allocated costs. Allocated costs are also referred to as shared costs. These are costs that benefit more than one program. Typical types of allocated costs that are charged to CACFP funds are utility costs, such as electric, gas, and water, and facility costs, such as rental and lease costs. An allocation method is a mathematical calculation used to ensure each program of the organization pays its fair share of the cost. The CACFP annual budget has a time and space allocation built into it. It calculates the CACFP allocation percentage that may be charged to CACFP funds for the specific utility and facility costs identified on the budget and supported by documentation. It is not a requirement to charge shared costs to CACFP funds, but if they will be charged, then ODE C&P must provide prior approval of both the type of allocated cost and the allocation method. This is an FNS instruction requirement. Written fiscal policies and procedures must identify the requirement for allocated costs and the allocation method to receive prior approval from ODE C&P before being charged to CACFP funds. CACFP labor costs are typically the second highest CACFP cost. I will be providing a high-level overview of labor cost documentation requirements, as time tracking systems and payroll systems vary by sponsor. Please refer to the quick reference guide for specific regulatory citings regarding documenting labor costs. All labor costs must be supported by records that document the total time worked by the employee, identify the portion of labor costs charged to the nonprofit food service account, and be supported by payroll records. This is a federal regulation and FNS instruction requirement. Let's discuss each one of these a little more in detail. Time and attendance reports, also known as timesheets, must be maintained for all labor costs charged to CACFP funds for all employees with CACFP activities. This includes hourly or salaried employees who complete part-time or full-time work. At a minimum, time and attendance reports must include the start time, the end time, and absences. It must be completed timely, coincide with the employee's pay period, and identify the total time actually worked by the employee, not just the time spent on CACFP activities. This is important, so I will repeat it. Time and attendance reports must document the total time actually worked. If this information is not documented, labor costs will be considered unallowable and cannot be charged to CACFP funds. Additionally, labor for employees that complete CACFP and non-CACFP activities, meaning their work involves CACFP and other organizational activities, must be supported by time distribution reports. Time distribution reports establish the portion of labor costs that may be charged to the nonprofit food service account. This report accounts for the total activity for which each employee is compensated based on actual hours worked on CACFP and non-CACFP activities. Labor costs may not be charged based on budget estimates. Lastly, in addition to time and attendance and time distribution reports, all labor costs must be supported by payroll records, which identifies the compensation paid to employees, including deductions and taxes. Written fiscal policies and procedures must identify that all labor costs charged to the nonprofit food service account will be in compliance with federal regulations and F&S instruction and be supported by records that identify the total time worked by the employee and identify the portion of labor costs charged to the nonprofit food service account and supported by payroll records. Okay, continuing with documentation requirements of labor costs, we need to discuss the difference between CACFP operational labor duties and CACFP administrative labor duties, and the requirement to track the time spent completing administrative duties separately from operational duties. Again, I am providing a high-level overview of administrative activities and labor costs, as each sponsoring organization operates the CACFP unique to their organizational structure. Please refer to the quick reference guide for more information on CACFP administrative duties and allowable costs. Operational duties are incurred through normal CACFP meal service operations in providing meals to eligible participants, and administrative duties are incurred in the planning, organizing, and managing of the CACFP. Based on your organization's structure, you may have CACFP positions in which staff complete CACFP operational duties or CACFP administrative duties, but not both. On the other hand, you may have positions in which staff complete both operational and administrative duties. This is important to note because time spent completing CACFP operational and administrative duties must be tracked separately from each other, and time distribution reports must identify the portion of labor costs charged to the nonprofit food service account based on the hours worked completing operational labor, administrative labor, and non-CACFP labor. This is an F&S instruction requirement. Let me restate this. So for all CACFP positions which charge labor to CACFP funds, time and attendance reports must identify the time spent completing CACFP operational and administrative duties, and time distribution reports must be maintained to support the portion of operational labor and administrative labor costs that are charged to the nonprofit food service account. If this information is not documented, CACFP labor costs are considered unallowable and cannot be charged to CACFP funds. So written fiscal policies and procedures must identify that CACFP operational and administrative labor must be tracked separately, and time and attendance reports and time distribution reports must be maintained to support all CACFP and non-CACFP labor costs. Okay, it's time to do another knowledge check. Here's the question. What documentation would you need to be maintained to support labor costs for an employee who completed CACFP operational duties and CACFP administrative duties? Would it be A, time and attendance reports, which are timesheets, B, time distribution reports, C, payroll records, D, all of the above? I'll give you a few moments to consider your answer. Okay, the poll closes in 3, 2, 1. If you chose D, you are correct. And look at that, 100% correct. That is awesome. The reason is all labor costs must be supported by time and attendance reports and payroll records. Time distribution reports are required for employees that complete CACFP operational and administrative activities, and for employees that complete CACFP activities and non-CACFP activities. Okay, we're on the fourth management control. The fourth management control is administrative costs. They may not exceed regulatory limits. We previously discussed administrative labor costs, but it's important to note that administrative labor is only one type of administrative cost. Other administrative costs may include costs for printing or copying forms, mileage reimbursement for site monitoring travel, and allocated facility and utility costs for the CACFP office space. The total of all administrative costs incurred, including administrative labor, are limited to 15% of the CACFP reimbursement. So let me state this another way. CACFP administrative costs must be tracked as actual, and the amount charged to the nonprofit food service account must be limited to 15% of the reimbursement. Sponsors are not required to charge CACFP administrative costs to the nonprofit food service account, but if they do, they must have a system in place to track CACFP administrative costs separately from CACFP operational costs. Written fiscal policies and procedures must document the requirement to track CACFP administrative costs separately from CACFP operational costs, and document the requirement to limit the amount of all CACFP administrative costs incurred to a maximum of 15% of the reimbursement earned. And if your organization chooses not to charge administrative costs to the nonprofit food service account, then this decision must be reflected in your written policies and procedures as well. Lastly, let's discuss the fifth management control and what is meant by having safeguards in place to prevent improper financial activities. Safeguards are simply the verification or double check in place to ensure written policies and procedures were followed. Verification is a required element of policies and procedures. It helps sponsors ensure compliance with program requirements and avoid findings. Each of the required fiscal policies and procedures we have discussed today must include a verification or a double check to ensure compliance is met. The verification can be included as a step in the procedure, or it can be a separate process in the procedure. Either option is fine, and this will vary by sponsor depending on the size of their organization and their organizational structure. And for example, a single site sponsor with minimal staff may need to have a board member be part of the verification process to ensure segregation of duties. There is no requirement how the verification must be completed. The requirement is to have a verification built into the policies and procedures. Okay, let's review what we have discussed. Written policies and procedures are not just a good idea, they are required for the operation of the CACFP. There are 5 specific management controls that are required to be included in sponsoring organizations' written fiscal policies and procedures. Let's review them one more time. They are fiscal integrity of all program funds. Program funds are only used for authorized purposes. Accountability of all expenses. CACFP administrative costs do not exceed regulatory limits. And safeguards are in place to prevent improper financial activities. ODE-CNP understands each sponsoring organization will develop written policies and procedures based on their organizational structure, so they will vary by sponsor, but in all cases, they must include the required elements. Fiscal policies and procedures must identify the management control, which is the policy, include the step-by-step processes necessary to complete the management control, which is the procedure, and include a verification or double check of the procedures to ensure compliance. Having written policies and procedures in place that reflect your organization's CACFP operations will help ensure your organization is in compliance with maintaining a nonprofit food service account. And now I'll turn things over to Shannon, who will review a nonprofit food service policy and procedure template with you.
Thanks, Teresa. So now that we've reviewed the CACFP performance standards with Darcy, and Teresa has given you a more detailed look at the 5 fiscal management controls, I'm going to walk you through the nonprofit food service policy and procedure template. As previously mentioned, all CACFP income and expenses must be accounted for separately from other organizational funds. This account is called the Nonprofit Food Service Account, or NPFS. All sponsors must have a written nonprofit food service account policy and procedure. This procedure will describe the sponsor's system to track income, expenses, and account balance. Sponsors may create their own written procedure, or they may use the ODE CMP template, which is what we'll be reviewing next. I did want to note that while this nonprofit food service policy and procedure template does cover all the required items that Teresa described previously, some sponsors may wish to have additional policies and procedures which explain the management controls in more detail. The template was provided to you prior to the webinar, but in case you don't have it readily available, Dusty will add the link to the template into the chat now. You're welcome to follow along on the blank template, or I will have sections of the template pulled up for us to review during the presentation. Before we get into specific sections, let's do a quick overview of how to use the template. You'll notice on the template there are gray fields in each section. Those gray areas indicate a place that needs to be completed by you as a sponsor and will be specific to your organization's operations. Please ensure that all sections are fully completed if applicable, and add in as much detail as needed to make each step clear. You will also see steps with checkboxes throughout the procedure template. Check those boxes only if that step is to be included in your procedure. If there is a field that is not applicable to your organization, you may leave it blank or you may delete it from the template. Remember, this template is meant to be customized so that it matches your organization's exact plan. Okay, let's take a look at the ODE CMP procedure template. The first section of the template covers the record process and timeline. Think of this section as a general overview of your nonprofit food service process. Question 1 is recording the type of software and tools used to track the nonprofit food service account. Please note the ODE CMP expense report, which is an option here, is a great tool to use, but it must be used in addition to your accounting program. In question 2, you will describe who is responsible for receiving the invoices and receipts and a description of how that initial receipt is processed. Next, question 3 will explain who is responsible for determining if the expense is allowable or unallowable, how this determination is indicated, and finally, how those expenses are double-checked and tracked. In question 4, if applicable, you will describe who is responsible for ensuring that all allocated costs are charged according to the ODE CMP approved allocation percentage. This is approved on the CACFP annual budget. Lastly, question 5 will explain who is responsible for ensuring a verification or double check is completed for all steps of the procedure. Double checks are an important part of any procedure as they ensure that the procedure is followed correctly. The double check can be done after each step or at the end of the month, depending on what works best for your organization. From here, the procedure template will break down into sections based on the type of expenses that your organization may have. All program expenses fall into one of 2 categories. They're either operational or administrative expenses. Those expense types must be tracked separately from one another. We'll take a look at some examples of expenses, but for more information, please refer back to that quick reference guide, which contains links to additional F&S guidance. The first type of expense we're going to take a look at is operating expenses. Operational expenses are those costs incurred by a sponsor in serving CACFP meals to participants, which can include purchased food costs, food service supplies, labor costs for CACFP food service duties, which can include meal planning, purchasing food, food prep, serving food or meal counts, contracted services, facility and utility costs, and other operational costs. It's important to note some of these operational expenses require ODE CMP prior approval. Sponsors who are required to submit a CACFP annual budget may only include expenses in the nonprofit food service account, which are listed on the approved CACFP annual budget. Some examples of unallowable costs include food purchased for personal use, meals for meetings, or non-creditable food items such as candy, soda, or potato chips, the value of donated food, and non-food supplies not related to CACFP meal service, such as toilet paper, toothpaste, or supplies for arts and crafts. Additionally, any expense which does not have proper documentation is unallowable, even if that expense would otherwise be allowed. Documentation must be maintained for all food service expenses. Going back to the procedure template, under operating expenses, the template will outline the process for each type of operating expense. Question 1 describes food expenses. Here you will describe who will enter the CACFP related invoice or receipt for food expenses, what program or software that expense is tracked through, the CACFP account number assigned, and when the expense is tracked. This section is applicable to all sponsors. Questions 2 through 8 will follow the same format as question 1, but will focus on different expense types, all within the operating expense category. The expense types listed in questions 2 through 8 are as follows: donated food items, labor costs, contracted services, facility cost, utility costs, and other operating costs. These expenses may or may not be applicable to your organization. If they are, ensure the checkbox is checked and complete the section in full. If it is not applicable, you may leave it blank or you may delete it altogether. Remember, if you are required to complete an annual CACFP budget, the expenses listed here in your procedure should match what is on your approved budget. We're going to pause here for a quick knowledge check on operating expenses. All right, the question is, which of the following expenses could be considered allowable operational expenses under CACFP? The options are whole milk, dish soap, baby wipes, cook's wages, ice cream for birthday celebrations, freezer for food storage, and coffee. I'll give you just a few moments to get your answers in. All right, the poll will end in 3, 2, 1. All right, good job, everyone. Looks like most of you got the right expenses. The correct answer was whole milk, dish soap, cook's wages, and a freezer for food storage can all be considered allowable expenses. Remember that some expenses do require ODE CMP prior approval. If you have unexpected food service costs come up that are not included on your approved budget, please reach out to your child nutrition specialist prior to purchasing for instruction. As a reminder, food items that are not creditable or not for CACFP meal service may not be charged to the nonprofit food service account. Those supplies or foods, if used for your center, must be purchased with other funds. Moving on to the next section of the procedure template, we'll take a look at administrative expenses. Administrative expenses are costs that are incurred by a sponsor during planning, organizing, and managing the CACFP. Allowable expenses in this category could be labor costs for activities such as site monitoring, program management, staff training, record keeping and accounting, contracted services such as bookkeeping. Other administrative costs can also be allowable. This could be miscellaneous expenses such as printing forms, mileage for site monitoring, and lastly, facility and utility costs. All administrative costs must be identified and included on the approved CACFP budget. In order for an administrative expense to be allowed, they must be documented with payroll records that show actual hours worked on CACFP duties, rental agreements, mileage documentation, itemized receipts, etc. Any expenses without proper documentation must not be included in the nonprofit food service account. Now let's take a look back at the procedure template. The section on administrative expenses is set up the same way as operating expenses. The main difference here is that some sponsors won't have any administrative expenses that they charge to the nonprofit food service account. This will vary by organization. The first question here will describe administrative labor cost expenses. If applicable, you'll check the box and fill in the blanks, best describing how your organization tracks these costs. This will describe who enters the cost, what program is used, the CACFP account number, and the timeline in which this is completed. Questions 2 through 5 are not shown here, but they will cover the following administrative expenses: contracted services, other approved costs, facility cost, and lastly, utility cost. Again, if it's not applicable, you may leave it blank, or you may delete the section altogether. If they are applicable, make sure to complete each section in full. Before we move on to the next section, we're going to do another quick knowledge check. The question here is, which of the following activities are considered administrative activities and could be an allowable administrative expense? The options are reviewing free or reduced priced applications, preparing the monthly CACFP claim, conducting CACFP monitoring and training visits, or all of the above. We'll take just a few moments to get your answers in. All right, so the poll will end in 3, 2, 1. Okay, great job. It looks like almost all of you guys got this one right. The correct answer was D, all of the above. Administrative costs are associated with planning, organizing, and managing the food service operation. These are all great examples of labor costs that could be charged to the nonprofit food service account with the correct documentation on file. Now that we've gone through both operational and administrative expenses, let's move on to determining nonprofit food service status. First, we'll look at how CACFP income is verified and tracked. Similarly to the expense tracking, you will describe who verifies the income, what program is used for tracking, and the CACFP account number assigned. Then you'll go into detail about how and where income documentation is maintained and what types of income are received. If reimbursement income includes funds from more than one grant or child nutrition program, please ensure your description includes details on how those are tracked separately. Income that is considered allowable in the nonprofit food service account can include CACFP reimbursements, CACFP pricing program revenue, vended meal revenue, non-program adult meal revenue, cash donations specifically for CACFP operations, interest earned on CACFP funds, as well as any other program funds from other federal, state, or local government sources. Question 2 refers to the CACFP cost regulation that Teresa described previously, which states that a minimum of 50% of the CACFP reimbursement must be spent on food used to prepare CACFP meals. This is an ODE CMP requirement. You will describe who is responsible for verifying this requirement is met, the process that is used to make that determination, and what will happen should the 50% requirement not be met to ensure that it doesn't happen again. The last question here, number 3, will outline the process in which administrative costs are tracked to ensure they do not exceed 15% of reimbursement. This includes the person responsible for verifying that costs do not exceed 15% of total reimbursement, the steps and documentation used to verify this, and the process that is followed if more than 15% of reimbursement is used on administrative costs to ensure that it does not happen again. Sponsors are not required to charge CACFP administrative costs to the nonprofit food service account. If this doesn't apply to your organization, you may remove it from the procedure. The next 3 questions gather information about the system in which the account balance is tracked. The nonprofit food service account must be reviewed monthly to determine the balance, with the process in place if the balance is negative or if it's positive. This account review must take place after the close of the claim month, once the claim has been submitted and reimbursement has been received. In question 4, you will describe the timeline in which a report will be run that will show the balance of the nonprofit food service account and who will receive this report. Then in question 5, you will describe who is responsible for completing a review at the close of each claim month to determine if other organizational funds must be transferred to the CACFP account to cover expenses that exceeded reimbursement. You will describe what account those funds are being transferred from, and if applicable, who will enter that information into the CACFP expense report. Lastly, question 6 will describe what your organization's process is if, at the close of the claim month, the CACFP fund balance is positive. If you have funds left over at the end of the claim month, they must remain in the nonprofit food service account to be used on future allowable child nutrition program expenses. Please note, if or when the nonprofit food service account balance is more than 3 months of average program expenses, this is considered to be an excessive operating cost fund balance. If this should happen, please contact ODE CNP to discuss a spend down plan. Finally, the last step in this section is year-end reconciliation, which happens at the end of your organization's fiscal year. In question 7, you will describe who will run the reconciliation report and in which program to ensure all transactions entered into the accounting program match the actual amounts received and spent. Like the previous step, you will describe here what position is responsible for either creating a spend down plan if there are excess funds at the end of the year, or who will transfer the funds to the nonprofit food service account if the account has a negative balance. It's important to remember that any unspent CACFP funds must be maintained and used solely for the improvement of the food service operations. We have now gone through the steps to record operational and administrative expenses, as well as income and determining nonprofit food service status. Next, we'll wrap up the template with 2 final important steps. These steps refer back to the general overview of the nonprofit food service process. Section B describes where the completed record is kept. This is the physical location in which your nonprofit food service account reports and documents are stored once they've been completed. Section C describes your backup plan. Here you will outline who the backup position will be should the position named in any of the steps within this procedure be unavailable. You'll want to be specific here, and if you have more than one backup, make sure they're all listed as well as the duties they are responsible for. And that wraps up our nonprofit food service procedure template. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I know that was a lot of information to cover. As it was mentioned previously, having written policies and procedures in place that reflect your organization's CACFP operations will help ensure compliance with maintaining a nonprofit food service account. Now I'm going to pass it back over to Teresa, who's going to walk through an activity with us.
Thank you, Shannon. Now that we have reviewed CACFP performance standards, financial management requirements, and the nonprofit food service procedure template, let's review a common financial scenario and put what we've learned into practice. Darcy and I will walk through an activity with you now. So this scenario deals with missing receipts. When reviewing operating expenses for the month, you notice that there is a charge to the organization's credit card for $200 from a local grocery store. However, you did not receive a receipt from the site supervisor that corresponds with that charge. After speaking with the site supervisor, they assure you that this purchase was for CACFP food supplies, but they are unable to provide the receipt to you. So as the financial contact, you should ask yourselves these questions. Can CACFP reimbursement funds be used for this purchase? And instead of a poll, we're going to use the chat box for this activity. So please type yes or no in the chat box, and I'll give you a few moments to answer. Okay, it looks like a lot of you have chimed in. And now I'll turn to Darcy. Darcy, could you please tell us the answer?
I can, and happy to do so, Teresa. I was watching the chat box fly by and I did not see one yes answer, which means you all got the answer correct. The answer is no. If documentation is not available to support the items purchased, even if the expense was otherwise allowable, it is an unallowable cost because it cannot be verified. Therefore, CACFP reimbursement funds cannot be used for this expense. Teresa, what's our second question?
Okay, the second question is, can this purchase be included in the CACFP nonprofit food service account? Again, use the chat box and please type yes or no, and I'll give you a few moments to answer. Okay, it looks like most of the answers are in. Darcy, do you want to share the answer?
Yep, I'm happy to do so. Again, I'm watching the chat box and it looks like the vast majority of you got this question correct. The answer is no. This is because there is no written documentation to support the items purchased. The cost cannot be verified as incurred. Also, the food items purchased are not documented and may or may not have been used in the CACFP meal service. Therefore, this expense cannot be included in the CACFP nonprofit food service account. Teresa, what's our third question?
Okay, here's the third question. If this purchase is not included in the nonprofit food service account, will this impact verifying that 50% of the month's reimbursement was spent on food? Please think about your answer and then type yes, no, or maybe in the chat box. Okay, and it looks like the answers are in. Darcy, will you please answer this last question?
Yes, I'd be happy to do so. So it looks like most of you got this question correct. The answer is maybe. Depending on the monthly CACFP food costs, this missing receipt may impact your organization's ability to document the requirement that 50% of CACFP reimbursement was spent on food. So the answer is maybe. Back to you, Teresa.
Okay, so now that we know this expense cannot be included in the nonprofit food service account or paid for with CACFP funds, what steps should you, the financial contact, take? So now we're going to go back to a poll and Caitlin will put it up. And here's the questions. Should you, A, charge the expense to other available organizational funds? B, review receipt procedures and retrain staff as necessary? C, save email communication or document your conversation regarding the missing receipt? Or D, all of the above? Please place your answer in the poll and then we'll come back. Okay, and the poll will close in 3, 2, 1. Darcy, will you please review the answer to this poll?
Sure, you are all rock stars. The answer to this question is D, all of the above. You will want to ensure this expense is not documented in the nonprofit food service account. You'll review your organization's policy and procedure on receipts and revise as needed to avoid this situation from happening in the future. You'll save all communications regarding the missing receipt, documenting what happened and what actions were taken as follow-up. And finally, you'll determine if staff need retraining and then provide that training as warranted. Caitlin, I'm going to send it back to you.
Thank you, Darcy and Teresa, for walking us through that scenario. We hope it helped to demonstrate how to put that financial policy and procedure into practice. Now we'll take some time to answer questions that have come in, both during registration for this webinar and questions from the chat while we've been presenting. As a reminder, if you have any questions on what has been presented today, please submit your questions in the chat to everyone and we will do our best to answer them. Okay, take it away, Dusty.
Hello, everyone. Here's our first question. I contract with a bookkeeper to maintain my business financial records. Do I still need to have a written fiscal policies and procedures? Darcy, would you mind answering this for us?
Sure. The answer is yes. All CACFP sponsors must develop and implement written policies and procedures for all key aspects of CACFP, including financial management. Sponsors must ensure the effective management and oversight of the CACFP, regardless if you contract with a third-party bookkeeper or accountant. Additionally, sponsors cannot contract out the management of CACFP to another entity. It is the sponsor's obligation to ensure adequate financial management practices are in place to meet CACFP regulations. Back to you, Dusty.
Thank you, Darcy. I understand that all CACFP costs must be supported by source documents, and as long as I maintain receipts for CACFP purchases, they are considered allowable CACFP costs. Is that correct? Teresa, would you please answer this for us?
Sure, I will. So the answer to that question is no. Source documents are required, but there are several other factors in determining if a cost is allowable. To be allowable, the cost must be incurred for the operation of the CACFP. It must be on the approved annual CACFP budget, and it must comply with F&S instruction and federal and state laws. So these requirements must be met in addition to maintaining source documents, as source documents alone are not sufficient to identify a cost as an allowable CACFP cost. Back to you, Dusty.
Thank you, Teresa. Our last question is, as a food program coordinator, I spend most of my time completing administrative duties, but I do help out in the kitchen occasionally. Do I need to track this time separately? Shannon, can you answer this question for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So the answer is that it depends. It depends on if your organization charges labor costs for your position to CACFP funds. If they do, you must track all time spent on operational and administrative duties separately, and these costs must be charged based on the amount of time spent on operational and administrative duties. If they do not charge labor costs for your position to CACFP funds, then the time spent completing CACFP operational and administrative duties is not required to be tracked separately.
Thank you, Shannon. If you have any additional questions that were not addressed today, please reach out to your assigned child nutrition specialist. Sponsors who are looking for additional information can refer to the ODE CMP monthly CACFP newsletter called Knowing and Growing. This newsletter will include all memos that were released in the past month, in addition to information on available grants, trainings, and important deadlines. This is sent out each month to all the responsible principals listed in your CMP web sponsor info sheet, and information in this newsletter must be reviewed by the responsible principals. Memo updates and program updates are required information for sponsors to know, while additional grant information and resources are available and helpful to review. If you're not on the list and you want to receive the newsletter, you can sign up by using the link on this slide that will be shared in the next chat box.
Thank you, Dusty. We did have one question that came in just right under the wire. Darcy, would you mind taking this question for us?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. The question is, couldn't a sponsor contract with hold on, I have to scroll back up again. Couldn't a sponsor contract with a food service management company to provide these services? And the answer is no. So with CACFP regulations, there is a regulation that says specifically that CACFP sponsors cannot contract out the management of the program to another entity. And unlike some other programs that are child nutrition programs, these folks cannot do monitoring, claims, submitting anything in C&P Web. Now, certainly they are valuable partners with you to operate your child nutrition programs and should be used as resources, but they cannot manage CACFP on behalf of any organization. Back to you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Darcy. It looks like we don't have any other questions that have come in. So before we end our session, here's a short message from the Oregon Department of Education. ODE supports equity and excellence for every learner and seeks to work with school districts, education service districts, and community partners like you. We believe all children should have access to high quality, well-rounded learning experiences. Additionally, this institution is an equal opportunity provider. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to participate in this training with us. We hope you all have a great rest of your day.